Welcome to Logical, the first regular podcast navigating the legal processes that shape the UAE. I'm Tim Elliott, and as ever, I'm with Ludmila Yamalova. Ludmila is the managing partner of the Dubai-based legal firm HPL Yamalova and Plethka. Always good to see you.
Great to see you too, Tim, and welcome back to the studio. It's lovely to see you in real flesh and blood.
It's good to be here, I have to say. I'm liking the new lighting. In this episode, it's a subject that resonates, I think it resonates deeply with many here in the UAE. It's the new domestic abuse law, Ludmila. Federal law number 13 of this year, 2024. The legislation replaces the previous 2019 law, enhancing protections for victims and imposing stricter penalties for offenders. So let's start with an overview. What does the new law basically encompass?
Well, as you rightfully said, and the new law, which was just passed a few months ago, and that's Federal Law number 13 of 2024, it actually replaces not so old law, domestic abuse law from 2019. And if you recall, you and I actually did a podcast on that very law a few years back. Mm-hmm. And at that time, that law was quite revolutionary. In its scope and its breadth and its application, and that was kind of one of the main reasons why we featured it, and we featured it the way we did back then, because at that point in time, even that version of the law was quite forward looking and progressive in terms of what it encompassed, the definition of domestic abuse, and who included the domestic family, if you will, that would be subject to the protection. So it was quite interesting that when we found out of this new law that does not just amend or build up certain provisions or introduce additional provisions to the old law, but in fact replaces the old law altogether. So this new law from this year, 2024, completely replaces or erases, if you will, cancels out the 2019 law, which we thought at the time was quite progressive already. And therefore I want to highlight that as progressive and as forward-looking as this new law is, we already had a fairly solid foundation. So the UAE already had, from a legislative standpoint at least, a fairly solid and strong foundation in terms of domestic abuse, what constituted domestic abuse, and the protection that were otherwise provided to victims of domestic abuse. So it's not that we're introducing or amending a law from 20 or 30 years ago. It's only a law from last 5 years, which was already had a fairly robust foundation. So I'd only imagine that the reason for this new law was perhaps that the societies and the country's growing understanding and acknowledgement of the importance of this issue, and perhaps realization that the law could be bolstered further in the interest of obviously the victims of society, but also perhaps a way of rehabilitating the accusers or the perpetrators, because they're still part of the society. So what do you do? Do you just lock them up, or do you come up with some other measures? And ultimately, in fact, that's kind of, in terms of the differences in the law, that is one notable difference between the previous version and the current law, version. And it's just that there is more measures here for rehabilitation of offenders. So that's one notable difference. Some of the other ones at a high level is the fines. The fines themselves have been increased substantially, and we can kind of go through specific fines. But in some cases, they've been raised 10 times. So that's a fairly significant increase, and therefore difference. And certain abuses also, and certain events also warrant, in addition to the fines, also lead to a longer jail sentence or imprisonment. And there's additional violations, for example, for violating restraining orders. So let's say, just an example, in the past, under the old law, the fines ranged from 1,000 dirhams to 10,000 dirhams, and imprisonment up to 3 months. Now it's from 10,000 dirhams to 50,000 dirhams, and imprisonment up to 6 months. So it just tells you from 1,000 to 10,000. It's basically 10 times, and doubling the imprisonment. Also, for example, in the previous law, there was no mention of perhaps obligation that others must follow in those who observe or witnesses of domestic abuse. So this is one thing that this new law introduced: a specific fine for those who witnessed the abuse, domestic abuse, and did not report. And the fine actually goes all the way up to 50,000 dirhams and potential imprisonment. So that's another notable difference from the previous law. There's also sort of stronger provisions on the emergency protection orders. So there is now an option for victims to apply for what's called an emergency protection order, kind of like an injunctive order, but this is done on the emergency basis. So the previous law kind of touched upon that particular measure, but it wasn't as specific. So the current law is kind of bolsters that measure and therefore protection for victims in more detail.
Okay.
And then, in terms of the definition of domestic abuse, it's more or less remains in the categories that it includes, more or less mirrors the previous version of the law, and that includes not just physical but economic abuse, psychological abuse, mental abuse, and so on and so forth. So the definitions per se did not change, but it bolstered certain categories further and expanded, in particular, the psychological abuse. Then with regards to, for example, the support services, the previous law had some basic references to support services that are available for victims, and the current law has much more enhanced framework for victims accessing shelters, counseling and comprehensive victim assistance services. With regards to confidentiality, for example, confidentiality protection, the previous law had some general references to it. The current law has a more stronger confidentiality and privacy measures. And as I said earlier, the rehabilitation of offenders or perpetrators, the previous law did not really make much reference. It was more, the focus was on punishment, and versus the current law is in addition to punishment. So what's next? How do we help perhaps these offenders to rehabilitate them and kind of reintroduce them to society? So it's not just punitive in nature, but it's also sort of I guess rehabilitative in nature, which is, I would say, in addition to penalties, perhaps this is the other kind of big difference or most substantive change. So there's a lot more emphasis on how do we help these offenders to learn the lessons, not just by punishing them, but perhaps changing their mindset and their cultural value set, and help them kind of reintegrate in society in a more cohesive manner.
It's certainly much developed. I'm interested, Ludmila, in the law from the standpoint of the victim. How does the new legislation impact people who are affected by domestic violence?
Well, yes, and so that's one change, if you will, that we've kind of observed at a high level, is just the law's perspective on victims in particular. So there's almost like the law is a little redrafted to focus specific sections on protecting victims. And so there is a lot more sort of the new law expands the definition of abuse as to some degree, and in addition sort of bolsters or adds additional definitions to economic and psychological harm, areas that were defined in 2019 law, but a little less so. And now there is from the victim's perspective. So what constitutes domestic abuse is a lot broader in scope. So it could include, for example, financial, or that's called an economic abuse. So let's say if your family member deprives you of access to money. So let's say, not to be not to be biased or prejudicial, but the more common example of domestic abuse is when between the husband and the wife. So let's say the husband were to deny the wife access to cash or access to money, and if you don't have money these days, even if you have so-called freedom to leave the house, you can only make it so far, especially if you live kind of in more remote areas. So that's that particular example now constitutes specifically under the law expressed example of domestic abuse. So if you just deny your family members ability to actually have freedom, to exercise freedom by virtue of not having money, then psychological abuse as well. So that's the law is a lot more specific in terms of and expressed in terms of psychological pressure and bullying and constituting a form of domestic abuse. And that, by the way, can also be between, for example, elderly members of the family. So, in cases where, let's say the grandparents or the aging parents are being denied ability to, for example, communicate with some other family members or socialize with their peers, and by just being kind of locked in the house and not perhaps physically like locked, where they cannot leave the house, but effectively denied the ability to leave the house either because they don't have a car, then they don't have money to call a taxi, and also effectively just being scared to leave the house because of the psychological pressure. So all of these examples under the current law constitute domestic abuse, and therefore would entitle victims to protection. So that's in terms of the definition, right? And then in terms of what victims can do, the law provides for the specific measure. And the previous law had some references to applying for the court's assistance vis-a-vis like an order petition, for example, requesting for the court to impose a restraining order. But now this specific law includes the emergency protection order. So it's like an emergency order, restraining order, where victims can now apply and have the immediate protection from abusers on the basis of this, until obviously the case kind of goes through the litigation or through trial. And this, in the context of domestic abuse, this is huge because those people who have either been unfortunate enough to find themselves in those kinds of situations, fear, the immediate fear of bodily harm and threat is all too real.
It's a huge difference.
Of course. And so they worry about, okay, well, if I report, I will report this, the case will go through the stages, where the investigation, and then further investigation, and then litigation and arguments and so forth. But what happens to me in the meantime? He will come after me in the meantime. I'm afraid for my safety in the meantime. Yeah. So this particular emergency protection order basically offers the legal tool for victims to I guess seek safety and have it be ensured by law, through the legal channels, so that while the case is going through its court process, at least the person has the assurance that from a legal standpoint they've got some sort of some safety from physical and bodily harm. So that's another one. And then also there's the victims have much better access to get through the law through shelters, counseling, and various programs, and based on mandated sort of services in coordination with various social services and law enforcement. So the law, again, the previous law had quite a bit about the types of services, or I guess the ability for victims to appeal to services, but the current law defines the types of services. It's not just going to the community service, but also it's the counseling, it's the medical facilities. So it sort of bolsters the definition of support services. And then perhaps the last one is just the confidentiality and the safety of the victim. So the law emphasizes the importance of confidentiality for victims and ensuring that, for example, the details are protected and kind of reducing the risk of retaliation. So these are kind of at a high level the big changes that give victims in particular, or at least that's the objective, is to give victims a safer and more supportive pathway to seeking protection and ultimately justice.
Okay, I would imagine that unfortunately some people listening to this are listening to try to understand what they can do about abuse, i.e. how can they report it, where do they go, what numbers do they call, what can you tell me, what advice can you give to somebody who is or might be experiencing abuse?
For sure. So part of it depends on who the victims are, whether they're women and children or whether they're elderly people. Because let's face it, there could also be men that could be subject to domestic abuse.
Sure, you've met my wife.
Yes, yes, yes. You're an example, a living example. So, one for example, for women and children, there's a special Dubai Foundation for Women and Children that has its own helpline and a website, and it kind of offers sort of immediate protection and support services for those women and children who face domestic violence and abuse. So there are centers across the country, but certainly there's a website, and that's the DFWAC, so Dubai Foundation for Women and Children, and they have their own website. There's a helpline, which is 800-111. And so that's one place that women and children can resort to, especially when there's an immediate need for safety and protection. So this foundation provides not just support services, but also facilities to ultimately provide shelter to such victims of domestic abuse. And then there's the predictable one is just the police in Dubai. It would be Dubai Police, and other Emirates it would be the Emirate Police offices. And there's the emergency number, which is the 999. And then there's the non-emergency numbers, which is 901, and so on and so forth. There's also specific crime reporting hotline, and then you can also report online. It's the Dubai Police website. That's a very handy tool to have, because much can be reported, and sometimes even more effectively. And perhaps practically more accessible than actually going to the police and reporting crime, because we know that in these kinds of cases of domestic abuse, victims often, as we've just discussed, may just physically not have the ability to leave the house. So how do you go to the police and report? So having that kind of access by phone, by apps, by website to report these crimes is very useful. And the Dubai Police actually has now a specific number dedicated for this, and they, in fact, even at the police stations themselves, they have specific departments that deal with crimes that involve domestic abuse. So that's and then, by the way, we've talked about this before on previous podcasts. So the UAE government since the COVID era. A bit of a blessing in disguise, has truly embraced and taken the next level the digital transformation, and all of these government services now are on apps or accessible through not just the website, the previous kind of traditional tool, but through apps. And these apps are and they continue to evolve and continue to progress. So a lot of these crimes can be reported straight through the apps, because let's face it, we know the website sometimes are a little more cumbersome in terms of kind of navigating and also even loading them up. Whereas the apps, there are specific apps, and Dubai Police also has specific apps where you can even record the crime as it's going, right? Like, for example, you can record the screaming, the yelling, even if it's not the video, but it's just the audio. So you can report the crimes by using these tools, which once again, for victims, provides these additional tools, which, until technology has become part of our lives as it has now here, were not available. And so the only way in the past was to call, basically just to go physically to the police, and sometimes be able to access by phone.
Well, I mean, it's long been appropriate, hasn't it? If you use the Dubai Police app to report, I don't know, a traffic accident, the pictures need to be uploaded through the app, and that's the way that you should do it. So I guess in some ways it's appropriate to work in that way in domestic abuse terms as well. It's logical.
Indeed, absolutely. And what we have seen recently, and perhaps this is predictable, is that sometimes those services are even more responsive than if you go to the station directly. Because first of all, the stations have different people. Obviously, during the night, if it happens during the night or early morning, there's different shifts, and so people may not be available. There is maybe queues and other people reporting their own crimes and such, and may require are standing in line and waiting and so on and so forth. But when you report it through these technological tools, now there's a record. So just by virtue of even basically reporting, there's a case number,
Yes.
which now you can follow up on. And there is some also sense of accountability on the other side, is that if that case number has now been logged. So what we've seen is that often reaching out through these kinds of means becomes more effective and more responsive. Because of this, the ability to kind of trace and therefore kind of inevitable sense of responsibility on the other side. Then there's, in addition to the police, there is the community development centers, and so it's called the CDA, the Community Development Authority. And so there's a hotline there. There's also the website. And so traditional, and this to an extent is still going on, is that any time there's a domestic abuse case, it would have to be reported to the CDA or Community Development Authority. And then they would liaise with the police and kind of coordinate. So that, to an extent, it still exists, except that now it seems that at least there's development to make these services available at the police stations themselves, so the victims don't have to go to different places to be able to lodge a complaint. So that's the basically most of the police stations these days do have this sort of child and women protection department, and they are either have representatives from CDA directly there, or they work much closer than in the past to be able to make sure to provide one place for victims to report their complaints. And then there's the Alamin service as well, which is has its own online hotline, has its own hotline and also its own email, and also offers a secure and confidential platform for reporting social and security issues. So these are just some examples of that exist for victims to be able to resort to in the unfortunate time or circumstances if they find themselves in victims of domestic abuse.
For sure. And we'll publish a list of these in along with this podcast as well. When it comes to the old law and the new law, what stands out for you? What significantly kind of separates itself for you, Ludmila?
Yeah, so number one is penalties. The penalties under the new law is just a huge difference. Yeah. And this is not to be understated, because although it just involves, obviously those who suffer domestic abuse, they think, what is money? But money is an effective way to reprimand and to restrain perhaps somebody from doing something, right? Mm-hmm. Because when it's used punitively. So in some cases, the penalties have gone up 10 times, from 1,000 dirhams to 10,000 dirhams, from 5,000 dirhams to 50,000 dirhams. So in the previous law, the cap seemed to be more around 5,000, 10,000 dirhams. Now we're going into 50,000, and for repeat offenses, it's even higher. And that's huge. So think of it this way. So if somebody beats up, they're again using the stereotype, the wife, and they get 10,000 dirhams, or 1,000 dirhams. Okay, well, whatever. They pay 1,000, 10,000. 50,000 dirhams is a different ball game. And if you and since the penalties go up for repeat offenses, so it can be fairly significant. So just to kind of give you an idea in terms of the specific offenses and the associated penalties. So let's say physical abuse, right? In the past, it was up to 5,000 dirhams. Now it's up to 50,000 dirhams, while sort of the jail sentence kind of remains the same, but it can also be increased for repeat offenses. In the past, the jail sentence remained the same. The physiological abuse, same sort of thing, from 5,000 dirhams to 50,000 dirhams. Sexual abuse, again, used to be 5,000 dirhams, now it's 50,000 dirhams. And as mentioned earlier, the violation of restraining orders, before it was 1,000 dirhams, between 1,000 dirhams to 10,000 dirhams, now it's 10,000 dirhams, so 10 times to 50,000 dirhams. And the new fine that was introduced for failing to report domestic abuse by witnesses. So in the past, there wasn't specific fine that was assigned to that. Think about it. It's basically for inaction, right? So you're being fined for inaction. So if you're a witness of domestic abuse, in the past, maybe you could extrapolate a penalty or there was an offense for somebody not to report. But this law specifically provides for those who fail to report. Now there's a penalty from 10,000 dirhams to 50,000 dirhams. So basically the penalties, the increase in penalties is number one, and that's not a small change. The other one, as we mentioned before, is this mandatory reporting by witnesses. In the past, there wasn't a specific provision that required for witnesses to report this crime ultimately. Now there is, and not only that, but the associate is fine with it. Then the next big change is this enhanced coordination for victim support, whereas the new law mandates more robust coordination among law enforcement and social services and healthcare providers, ensuring the victims receive comprehensive assistance. Now, I want to highlight that this is obviously the legal framework, the legal foundation to provide victims of domestic abuse support in the future, and also to identify certain, I guess, effective tools for perpetrators to kind of ultimately, hopefully, eradicate these kinds of practices from their behavior. But this is just a legal framework. In practical terms, we'll have to pass, and that when I say coordination between services, the law certainly sets the foundation for coordination between the different services. But in practical terms, perhaps it will take some time, and we'll report on this as time goes on. But I'm sure there's a lot more that can be done to facilitate and improve the coordination between the relevant services to give victims a much more immediate and necessary help. And I guess the final difference, as we discussed before, is this focus on rehabilitation. So just beyond the punitive measures, as was the case in the previous law. And let's face it, some of these could be a result of substance abuse. So now there is a lot more, I guess, mention or references in the law, in different types of laws, of facilities that are provided for treatment of substance abuse. And there's also psychological centers to kind of psychological kind of rehabilitation as well, cultural. That because this is a new provision in the law, I would imagine that in the future, we will hear of more facilities that are being set up, or rehabilitation centers that are being set up specifically to help address these societal issues.
Okay. To what extent are domestic workers protected under this law? I mean, obviously they come under the umbrella of the law, but is any special, I don't know, is there a special case made for domestic workers?
Well, it's interesting because I've actually had this debate with a few other legal minds in the UAE when the law came out. I mean, they didn't quite see this law to encompass domestic workers the way we did. So obviously some of it is legal interpretation. Right. But to me, there's a number of provisions in the law that, to me and to us, kind of as a collective group of legal brains, the scope of the law is, and the objective of the law is pretty clear. So ultimately it protects, and also it's the scope of the law, but also it's the cultural framework, right? So it protects anybody who ultimately comprises your family, your home. And so the UAE is obviously for some people from the West, it may be more difficult to understand how a very common UAE sort of family dynamic is structured. And that is where first of all, people live here in kind of in larger families, extended families, right? It's not as it is in the West, for example, each family is kind of, you have kids, the kids get married and they move away from their parents. The parents live separately, grandparents live separately, the kids live separately, and so on and so forth. Here, they're much more of an extended family dynamic. So there'll be kind of bigger houses, compounds where several generations of family members live. And to add to that, and this is quite perhaps not so unique to the UAE only, but it's very specific of the UAE, is the access to domestic employees, the services of domestic employees. And so in the UAE for domestic employees, there is specific law that governs them. There's a specific visa category that governs them. And then there is a specific sort of cultural and practical setup in terms of how they function, where they live. And that is they live as part of the family. They live in the same house, in the same compound. They, at least presumably, should be eating the same kind of food. They sleep very often with their children, with the children that they look after. So they cook, they clean, they drive, and there's a whole, the domestic employee law has a whole category of the types of domestic employees. But ultimately, from a legal standpoint, so they are on the visa of the family member, right? Which means, and so because it's subject to specific law, so as per this law, they live with the family. They have 1 day off, and they live with the family. So what does that mean? And so these people are part of the family. So they don't have a home of their own, and they cannot, even in legal terms, just because they are from the immigration standpoint, they're on the sponsorship of the family. And because of this sort of dynamic of, especially the kind of the more extended family, there's big families, many of them. So in all ways, from a legal standpoint, practical standpoint, cultural, sociological, psychological, they are under the control of the family. And therefore, in our legal interpretation, and there's different references throughout the law that make it very clear to us, at least, that because basically it applies to anybody who who falls under the control or guardianship of a household, is deemed as a family member. And so these individuals are exactly that. And in fact, for domestic employees, let's say when you look at their residence visa, it says the nanny of the domestic employee of such and such. So it's like they do, ultimately, they are a family member because they fall under the control and guardianship. And equally so, they also have control and guardianship over the children, right? So if they were to commit a crime or some sort of domestic abuse against the elderly or the children, under which law would they be persecuted? Under this law as well, because they comprise this very intertwined family dynamic that's very, very typical and specific to the UAE. So they are under control and guardianship of the family, and they also have control and guardianship of family members. So therefore, if you read the law closely and the different provisions in the law, it's very clear that this law intends to protect all those who fall under the control and guardianship of the family, which would include domestic employees. So basically that's and then we know that when a domestic employee who is completely at the behest of the family in terms of where they live, where they can go, and also what they can eat, and we see these cases where they have often been being denied food. So when the domestic employee is being denied food, under which law do they complain? So somebody doesn't give me food, like, is it, how's it a crime? What makes it a crime is that this dynamic, because they are ultimately a family member, because if they lived on their own, they can go get their own food, right? If they actually had access to their own salary, then they could buy their own food. But so the reason here, and that's a good example perhaps to show how the domestic employee law, as we legal practitioners see it, absolutely encompasses and embodies the protection over domestic employees because of that. Because if something like this were to happen and domestic employees being denied food, under what law are they reporting this crime? What's the violation of which law? It would be the domestic employee law. So basically from our perspective, absolutely the law is very clear and specific that encompasses protection, and it's meant to protect domestic employees as well.
I mean, that kind of covers it, I think. But any final takeaways for anybody watching this or listening to this? Final thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think it's a great, I guess another great example of seeing how the UAE's legislative framework continues to evolve. And how much leapfrogging it does, and that's why I preface this particular discussion with a kind of a short, and maybe not so short history of what this law, what it amends or what it changes, and it's a fairly recent law. So this particular law, we already had a foundation, a pretty robust foundation. So it's not as much of a leapfrogging as just so many other laws we've seen, but still the fact that just 5 years later, the government or the legislators are not just amending amending but canceling the old law and introducing the new law, just tells you that the UAE continues to monitor these different aspects of, I guess, society, and where it feels that it needs to further bolster legal protections, it doesn't hesitate to do so. I mean, think about it. 5 years is not a huge time, and as I said earlier, the 2019 law was pretty broad in its scope, and it was pretty effective from a legal standpoint. So the fact that just 5 years later we have a new law that further introduces more protection for victims and society in general just tells you that the UAE, it's this kind of exciting time to continue to be in the UAE, because new laws keep coming, new legal frameworks are being so shaken up all the time. And obviously the UAE continues to want to model itself against some of the best international practices, and this is just one example of that.
It doesn't seem like 5 years since we've talked about that on this exact podcast, for sure. That's another logical, this time domestic abuse in the UAE, the new law 2024. Thank you for listening, for watching, or both, if you're with us on YouTube in particular. Thanks as always to our legal expert. Ludmila Yamalova is the managing partner here at Yamalova and Plethka. Ludmila, appreciate your time.
Tim, always great chatting with you. Thank you.
You can find us across social media, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, pretty much wherever you get your social updates, and wherever you find your podcasts. There's our website as well. Lots and lots of information there. The podcasts are there. Everything is free too. If you'd like a legal question answered in a future episode of Logical, or if you'd like some help from a qualified UAE experienced legal professional, just go to lylawyers.com and click Contact.